Hello, welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Buino, and I'm so excited to be sharing today's interview with you. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. Please join us starting in June for our online NARM training in learning how to transform trauma. This online NARM basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it's essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. NARM provides a relational approach to addressing the current COVID pandemic and tools to support healing in the aftermath of this collective trauma. If you're looking for more advanced training in complex trauma and are working in mental health, healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit at www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Thanks for joining us for today's episode. We asked Claude Cayemitte from one of our earliest episodes, actually, of the Transforming Trauma podcast to join me today to kind of catch us up with what's going on in current events. So you'll be hearing Claude talk a lot about what we are experiencing right now as a national trauma and crisis, and the way that he's been applying NARM principles to what's happening right now. So let me tell you about Claude again. He is a clinical social worker who has experienced working with trauma and substance abuse treatment in low-income communities. Claude is an award-winning psychotherapist, receiving the Minority Fellowship Award from the Council of Social Work Education for his work with at-risk teens. Claude is a certified clinical trauma professional through the International Association of Trauma Professionals. Claude is also a NARM-certified therapist working at a residential treatment center for teenage boys and families. Claude believes in the healing power of conversation, allowing him the privilege to help people overcome obstacles to being happy, healthy, and connected. So please take a listen to my conversation with Claude Cayemitte. Hello, Claude.
Hello. How are you, Sarah?
So you have graciously agreed to share some space with me so that we can name some of what's going on with all that's happening in the world right now in the lens of NARM as it relates to trauma. So wherever you'd like to start.
Yeah. Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for having this opportunity or allowing me to have this opportunity. This is important. Anything that we can do to take one brick off this pyramid, this ugly monument of racism, if we can take one brick off at a time, whatever we can do to do that, I want to just acknowledge. And at the same time, you know, it's about damn time. I mean,
Yes.
I'm saying that with love, of course.
Of course.
Yeah. But yeah, I think, you know, I was talking about this before, like my takeaway from the current events in relation to what I spoke about with you and the previous episode is like, I believe that we are witnessing a traumatic response or a response to a trauma and that we've been suffering, that the Black community has been suffering for a long time, and that pain being bled out and people sort of connecting to their experience and watching that horrific video has led to this crisis being observed and being acted upon. And so the first piece that I sort of took away from what was happening was like, oh my gosh, like I've never seen something so even now I'm trying to find words for it.
Right.
I think this is it. Like it's something that you can find words to. And the global community kind of responded in a way that I think is different because there's even been language around trauma now about how this is a traumatic thing. And I think it's important. Like NARM is such a great model to give language around what's happening and to use a frame around what's happening versus the typical frames. Not to say that those are wrong or invalid, or all those frames are, of course, like the social, political, the criminal justice, you know, everything like that. Even there's a spiritual, I mean, that's great that the spiritual community is talking about it, but in a traumatic and clinical lens, this has been the message I'm talking about. Like these situations can be seen from a clinical perspective, and the macro over here and the micro over here they're not these separate things. They are together.
Yeah, such a good way
And
to put that.
yeah, yeah, and this could be a gateway. Having these specific conversations about racism is a gateway
Mm-hmm.
into societies and people's interpersonal relationships to trauma. So for me, it's really about, like, I'm noticing people really finally connecting to it,
Mm-hmm.
connecting to what's been happening in this country and to the experiences of people emotionally,
Mm-hmm.
not just intellectually, but in terms of into themselves. And I think that's the difference with this reaction.
Yeah.
More people are connecting emotionally to themselves while
Mm-hmm.
connecting also to the experiences of people of color, right?
Yeah.
Because it's either been complete disconnection, which is the all lives matter, all that kind of stuff. Like it's all about me and my feelings and all that.
Right.
Or then it's like the other side where it's like just acting out from, a place of just, I mean, either way is not bad. I'm not condemning either way, but this is just like there was a lack of holding the complexity and a sense of
Yes.
a balanced, um,
Mm-hmm.
matured way.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's really, hopeful in spite of this tragedy. That's
Mm-hmm.
really a hopeful thing that the 50-50 concept of saying 50% connected to you, to
Right.
ourselves and to other people, objectification, what was possible for what he did was extreme objectification from himself as a police officer and
Right.
George Floyd, right? That's why they're saying say his name. He was a person, right?
Yeah, I was literally thinking that we need to also put a timestamp on this too, because who
Yeah,
knows when people be listening to this in perpetuity. This is, June 2020 when George Floyd was murdered by a police officer.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think seeing that is what happened. Those concepts came to mind. Like Narm talks about being connected to
Hmm.
ourselves and other people. Narm talks about
Hmm.
objectification in a completely different way that's been normally talked about. And Narm talks about traumatic responses and strategies in a
Hmm.
different way that's not talked about. And that language could be really helpful for people navigating this complex and really charged topic of racism.
Right. And we actually talked at length before we started recording, and you said so many brilliant things. I was like, oh, I wish we were recording then. But one of the things that we were talking about is essentially a lot of times with racism, white people will say, I'm not racist because I don't do XYZ, right? I don't do
Right.
these prejudiced things. And do you want to repeat what you said about the spectrum?
Yeah, so what I was saying was like we've all been breathing in white supremacy, being
Mm-hmm.
born in America because America
Mm-hmm.
was birthed on white supremacy.
Yeah.
It's no argument that the founding fathers owned slaves,
Mm-hmm.
and there's blood soaked in the soil in the land that we're standing on with indigenous people and African slaves. So in breathing all that in, we are all sort of quote unquote infected with racism. And it's in the
Yeah.
infection.
Oh,
It's a
oh, that hurts. And it's so
yeah,
true.
yeah, yeah.
Go on. Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt.
and when I said all, I mean all. I mean black people
Yes.
as well, and it's a spectrum in the sense of what it looks like with people. So we were talking about on one end of this extreme end of the spectrum, it's the police officer who murdered George Floyd, right? His symptoms of racism are so overt,
Right.
it's led to that. Right.
Right.
And I think a lot of white people look at that as like, okay, that's what a disease looks like. It's like, no,
Right.
and there's so much more in between, right? And the
Right.
other side of the spectrum, that with reflection and with difficult conversations, with education, with connecting emotionally to your own humanity and the humanity of someone else who looks differently from you move
Hmm.
towards the other end of the spectrum. But you're still on the spectrum because
Right.
again, it's like we've been growing up with it, so you have to filter it out. It's layers and layers and layers.
And you have to
Around.
see it first, and then you can filter it out. And it's
Exactly.
often so invisible to white people.
Yes, exactly. And to
Hmm.
put context, like it's because white people have been conditioned and structures have been put in place to avoid that,
Yep.
right? To
Yep.
avoid the reflection,
Exactly. Yeah.
and to to be denied the true history of the experience of people of color in their education system, and to be put with so much misinformation and to
Hmm.
all this kind of other strategies. It takes active work to move against status quo of color blindness or
Right.
sort of things like, oh, I'm not racist because I have a black friend, or I'm not racist because I don't say the N word. All these things are just sort of strategies to not deal with this
Right.
huge issue. So,
And one of the things that I've learned from the book White Fragility, that's by Robin DiAngelo, and she talks about
mhm,
racial stress.
Hmm.
racial stress tolerance.
Tolerance, exactly.
And so white people, because we are the normal, we are the standard essentially in society's eyes, we don't tolerate it because we don't experience it. She says in her book the first time she experienced it was when she was 28. Same for me. I didn't even know the term white privilege until I went to grad school.
And what you're talking about with the low stress tolerance is like in NARM, we talk about like a survival strategy, right? And so for African
Mhm.
Americans, I mean, I'll just define the term briefly. Like a survival strategy is a way to move away from an intolerable state, an internal
Mhm.
state. So the strategy is a behavior or a thought pattern that kind of disconnects us from a primary emotion, right? And
Yeah.
so with white people, the stress of acknowledging, right, that this racism is existing, it can come up with a lot of things like, am I a bad person? Oh my God,
Yes.
guilt, shame,
Right.
sadness, helplessness. It's so scary to connect to. So then there's
Mhm.
a disconnection. Oh no, but I'm this, but I'm that. They're just still strategies. But
Right.
African Americans, we have to have a higher tolerance because if I disconnected from the belief, if I was just like, everything's fine, this is a great
Mhm.
world and pull yourself, I would be killed immediately at 12, at 9, 10 years old because of
Right.
the ignorance around what the truth is in my environment. My environment is threatening to me. My environment is sees me as a threat and acts as if I'm a threat, and that can kill me.
Right.
So at 9, 10 years old, that's when my tolerance practice begins. That's what is passed down.
Right.
And so this is what's been happening with the conversation, the disconnect with the conversations. Like Black
Right.
people have PhDs in this subject,
Yes.
and white people who are in power and in charge of the levers of the system, right, are at kindergarten level. And the
Right.
poor emotional tolerance, like, it's just like it causes a disconnect. And then there's reactions, there's acting out to the
Right.
extreme, all the way to the extreme. And then there's acting in with the guilt. And those are terms that with Narma talking about the
Mhm.
actions that we take, how we relate to a situation.
And within that, you had done a webinar for NARM on kind of integrating these anti-racist principles with NARM, and you talked about internal racial superiority and internal racial oppression. Do you want to
Yeah.
share that with listeners right now?
Yeah, yeah. So what I was talking about with that is because the systemic racism comes in so many different forms, right? Not just the criminal justice system, but it's projected out through media and through interactions. Like the message around racial inferiority of Black people is everywhere, right? And it's kind of communicating out, and we sort of drink that in, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so that's where the internalization process happens, where it's like the formation of our identity is not independent of just the house, right? Of just like my mom and dad and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
It's in our institutions and all that stuff. So in psychology, when they talk about like the ego and the identity formation, it's sort of limited to like just attachment figures, right? That's true,
Right.
right? And
Mhm.
that we are part of an attachment figure with the society, right?
Yes.
And
Oof.
yeah,
Yes.
that we're in a relationship.
Mhm. And we have an abusive parent.
Exactly. Black people are been in an
Mhm.
abusive relationship, a traumatic relationship with America, with the American system.
Mhm.
And what you're seeing now is like a cry of like, you have violated the contract. You have violated the agreement of this relationship that we have participated in, right? And no more.
Mm.
Right? This is the battered wife saying no more, right? And so with what I was talking about in the NAR perspective is like from a clinical side, like we can't just talk about, a person's, any sort of symptom that they come into therapy, right? Depression, anxiety, trauma, shock trauma, whatever. We can't just talk about that while ignoring this past and present internalization, right,
Mm.
of these messages around themselves in relationship to race. So whether it's white people,
Right.
right, talking about their whiteness in relation
Mhm.
to their personal quote unquote struggles. When I say personal in quotes, it's because the political is personal. I don't believe that things are separate, but that's another thing. But in the context of trauma, it's like if white people have been internalizing their superiority, that I believe there's a connection with that and what's going on in the therapy practice. And it's the
Yes.
same thing with Black people. And I think it's
Mhm.
a disservice to not talk about the trauma that's happening all around them
Mhm.
and that's happening within them that can be partially driving the dysfunction that you see in other areas through a clinical lens, depression, anxiety,
Mhm.
codependency, whatever it is.
Yeah. I just want to comment too on the political and personal. I think because white people have been socialized that it's rude and it's improper to talk about race, we have then made it political, and we're not supposed to talk about politics or religion or things like that in company where we don't know what people's beliefs are. And that's part of what keeps censoring us. And until we recognize that it's not actually political at all, it's just, like you said before, it's a human crisis, period. Is this not political?
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I think that what I was talking about in the webinar is like therapists, it's not as if like when I do individual therapy, I'm not engaging in a political process, because when I enter the room, especially for me as a Black man, that shows up, right? If I have a
Right.
white client, right? Same way if
Hmm.
you're a woman, right? And you have a male client or another female client, right?
Hmm.
Or, I said this example in the webinar. I'm a heterosexual cisgender male and I'm having a bisexual client from me. That stuff shows up,
Hmm.
right? Whether it's explicitly said through the client or not. So I'm always sort of holding those sort of dynamics into play, and I can look for how they show up clinically. And I'm not afraid to bring
Hmm.
that stuff up because I'm communicating like I acknowledge this. This is a reality because it's a
Right.
part of your reality and my reality. And if therapy is about talking about how you relate to reality, right?
Right.
This is a part of it too. And I think just what you said, like white people have been sort of, this is not a part of the reality. They've been actively denying the message of the Black people and
Hmm.
disconnecting from themselves around the reality of their whiteness
Hmm.
and its privilege.
Right. And until we develop the racial stress tolerance to be able to have more of these conversations, nothing will change.
Yeah,
That's why
absolutely.
there's violence right now.
Yeah, absolutely. The lack of tolerance. We can use a clinical example, with narcissism, right? They can't
Hmm.
tolerate the vulnerability. They can't
Yes.
tolerate the
Hmm.
fear of the pain of whether it's rejection or critique or all
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
So they're so disconnected, right?
Right.
They will objectify everybody else. And that has
Yep.
consequences, not just for the people that they hurt, but for themselves,
For themselves.
right? They may have repressed so much that small voice because as human beings, we're meant to connect. We're meant to hold all of our stuff, right? We're
Right.
meant to access every area of ourselves. And so whether that's repressed so much or not, it's important to understand that, like, from a clinical perspective, it's like, look, like, this is what you're doing, right? And this is it's how it's going to look like if you don't stop.
Hmm.
And a lot of people, it takes like a crisis for something that's for them to say, you know what, maybe the way I've been living isn't actually working for me anymore.
Right.
And that's what's happening in this country. They're like, this is not working anymore.
Right. And finally, now that white people are deciding this isn't working for me either.
Hmm.
Right. Instead of this is just a problem for people of color, this
Yeah.
is actually, it is hurting all of us. It's
Yeah.
always been hurting all of us.
I think the message is like, I don't want to see I'm tired of seeing this stuff. I don't want to ever want to see that again. I don't want
Right.
to see a person with their knee on their neck. I don't want to see that on the news anymore. I don't want to feel the feeling of shame and disgust or anger and all that kind of stuff. Those are the people who are sort of acting out. I don't want to see the people that I care about who are Black and brown in pain anymore. Or I don't want to see them or hear them talk about this stuff anymore. Enough is enough. That's been the chant too. Enough is
Right.
enough, you know?
Right. Well, I feel like we could talk about this for hours and hours more. And yet,
Yeah.
does that feel like a space that's essentially, I can't even say that, do you feel complete?
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I would just say, like, I feel complete if I say this, like, in listening to the episode, if I remember my intention for the episode, I encourage everyone to connect to their authentic experience. If you feel
Mhm.
the anger come up, if you feel the
Mhm.
sadness, if you feel the confusion or helplessness, connect to that,
Yeah.
right? Because even though it feels uncomfortable, that's the opportunity for you to move to a different place, to respond differently, to grow from that. Because that's what I was saying to the therapist.
Mm.
It's like there's so much opportunity and growth in talking about this topic personally and professionally.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just continue that in relation to George Floyd. It's like, because people are doing it, that's why we have in 24 hours, the officers were arrested. In another few days, the more officers, like, it does lead to the thing that you want for yourself and for the people around you.
Yeah. Thank you. Just thank you.
Thank you as well. I appreciate that.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can check out the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The Transforming Trauma podcast is brought to you by the NARM Training Institute. NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals are offered across North America and internationally. Please join us starting in June for our online NARM training in learning how to transform trauma. This online NARM basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. NARM provides a relational approach to addressing the current COVID pandemic and tools to support healing in the aftermath of this collective trauma. Join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit at www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.